Urbanization on children's well-being around the world. And my name is Roey Stern. I'm a business major specializing in marketing and a minor in data science. And this is how I kind of got to working on this type of project for my IT 556 class. When I started working on this project, I wanted to explore what kind of data that would interest me. And I came across the World Bank data website, and they have a very extensive amount of data about indicators about every country around the world. And I came across the urbanization data, and it really struck me about the dramatic change from 1960, which is the earliest the World Bank has data about countries to today, 2020s, and the major increase in urbanization. It may seem obvious that today we all live in cities, the majority of us, but in 1960 the world was very different than it was today. And I wanted to see what other indicators may have experienced a similar type of change that maybe can correlate with urbanization. And I found that the World Bank has some indicators about children's well-being, like education and mortality rates, that can give us some form of indication. So we're going to start with the pool of countries that you can see here. As I mentioned before, urbanization has increased around the world in the past 60 years dramatically, but some countries more than others. The countries that you can see before you all have experienced more than a 40% growth in urban population rates in the past 60 years. We have a very wide representation here of countries from all continents around the world. We can even see one of the greatest powers of today's world in China that experienced, as you can see, about 45% of urban population growth from 1960 to 2020. It's kind of hard to imagine, a country that 60 years ago was predominantly rural to be one of the major players in the world today. Apart from having representation from every continent, the majority of the countries here are from Africa, and which is going to focus a little bit more. And one of those countries will be Gambia, that, for instance, experienced a 50% increase in their urban population. The 40% increase threshold that I chose was because that it gave me a nice cutoff of the top 25 countries in the world. Moving on to the world map, this will be an interactive chart. The red represents the lower part of urban population rates. The darker red it is, the lower the urban population rates are. And this is how the world, these countries looked at in 1960. And when I play this animation, it looks better on the software I created it on, but when we get to 2020, you can see how all the countries shift from red to green and even dark green, meaning that the majority of the population lives in urban cities. I point out Africa, and as a continent, Africa is perceived as a very rural nation or continent. That most countries, when you imagine Africa, live in villages, not in cities. That was sort of true in 1960 when only 14% of the population lived in urban communities or cities, but in 2020, this number rose to about 50%, which means that Africa has changed dramatically. It's not the same continent that it was in 1960. That had a lot of effect on the population. Imagine growing up in a village and then moving to a big city. That changes your life completely, and especially for children. And when we think about children, the first thing we think about is education. Like, are they getting education? Because that will be the tool that they use as adults to create their life and benefit their families. So I focus on education as part of the indicators for children's well-being. And I chose to focus on 4 countries from Africa: Algeria, Botswana, Gambia, and Cameroon. The flag over there, the one I don't know, it's Gambia. I chose to focus on that country because it really had a major change. The red lines represent their out-of-school rates for primary education. Out-of-school rates means the rate of children that do not go to school. For, in this instance, primary education being children under the age of 12. So in 1975, which is the oldest data points we had in the World Bank website, 76% of children in Gambia did not go to primary school. So at that point in time, almost every kid did not go to school, which today seems kind of odd for us, especially in our privileged position. And at the same time, the urban population rates were 24%. And when we think about it, it kind of makes sense, because if you live in a village, it's not like you have a school right next to you. But as we can see in 2017, you can see that line decrease very drastically. And in 2017, 76% of the children in Gambia go to school, which has been a major increase, well, positive decline in out-of-school rates. And I found it really interesting to see how the overpopulation rate skyrocketed to 60%, meaning that both of these things happen around the same time span. And it may not be the only reason why children in Gambia started going to school more, but in my notion, cities, they provide the infrastructure to have more advanced economic systems and educational systems that allow the creation of schools and more educational systems and allow for growth for the government to invest in education. And again, urbanization may not be the only cause, but I think it laid the groundwork to see this drastic change in rates. When we think about children, again, we focus on their health. And one of the cruel indicators, but the one that kind of represents the most about how healthy or the access to health services that children has are mortality rates. This chart represents the average mortality rates and average overpopulation rates for all the countries that were previously mentioned. And we can see that in 1960, we have the red line represents the under 5 mortality rate, meaning the children under 5 that die, and the orange line represents the infant mortality rate, so death at birth. And we can see that in 1960, we have an absurd number of 200% for under 5 mortality rate and 120% for infant mortality rate. At first, when I saw that, I was confused, like it's more than 100%, it should not be possible. But when I went over the data, that was the case, meaning that in these countries on average, for every child under 5, 2 die. And for every child that was born, 1.2 children die. That was absurd to think about. And only 60 years ago that, chances of survival was so slim in those countries. And as I mentioned before, like countries like China that were like a world-leading country today. And then you look at their overpopulation rate, and it's 27% on average around all the countries. So when you think about it, and living in rural areas and not having the same type of infrastructure also affects how health systems look and the overall conditions of living. We can later see that around the 80s and 90s, overpopulation rates have crossed infant mortality rates and under 5 mortality rates, and indicating that as urbanization increased, those mortality rates have decreased. Again, this may not be the only reason why these happen. Of course, advancements in technology and medicine contributed, but again, I go back to my same argument that cities and urbanization gave the infrastructure for these advancements to happen. When you think about it again, in a village, you may most likely not going to find a hospital or even like a care clinic. In a city, though, it's prevalent to have a hospital around you in some sort of vicinity. It's part of what a city is and what a city includes. And if we look at this graph and we kind of use our imagination to see where these trends are going in the future, we can see that urban population is indicated to keep rising while the mortality rates keep decreasing, which is a very good sign for the mortality rates, but also indicate that the world is progressing toward a more urban form of living, and we can see that it has a positive effect on children's well-being. My main takeaways from this research was how the world changed in the past 60 years. For being born in 1997, which is a lot older than your average senior in this 2022 class, but I grew up in a city. I can't imagine living in a village. When I came to Marymount, one of my main things that attracted me the most was being in such an urban setting in Boston and right across the DC. And think about how 60 years ago in some countries that I personally visited as a tourist, they were just predominantly rural. And when you think of it, when I thought about it more, and I realized that urbanization played a really, really big part about it. And I think that my research can be used as a good strategic analysis for projects of urbanization. When countries decide on what to invest in, should they invest in more foreign capital, or should they invest in building more security for their army? Maybe increasing their urbanization can help across the board for many aspects of life, and especially for children. As we saw, growing up in better living conditions can have positive effects on both their education and their health. That was all I have for today. Just to clarify a little bit about the charts that you guys saw. This was part of our IT 556 class, and we were working with a software called Tableau. And it's a software that allows you to plug in data and use its numerous chart options to plot very nice visualizations. Kind of like my colleague said before, visualizing data is a lot more pleasant to look at than just raw numbers. And that's what the software does. That's all I have for you guys today. Thank you very much for your attention.